If I could have your attention, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Fishtalk. This Fishtalk is sponsored by the Student Government Association of Palm Beach Atlantic University, and I really do want to thank them for making this possible. They have done a tremendous amount of work so that this event can go forward, and I just want to thank everyone for being here. So welcome to Palm Beach Atlantic University's Fishtalk. Today's talk is Porn Idol, Christians and the Problem of Pornography. I am Don McCulloch, and I'm a licensed psychologist, and I'm a professor here at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And the content of the talk that I'm about to deliver is in no way a reflection of the views of Palm Beach Atlantic University, but it is solely my own information, and I am bringing this to you because, as I tell my colleagues, I have a new interest in pornography, and I developed this interest not by accidentally surfing the web, but I developed it because, as a psychologist, a lot of my clients have been reporting problems with pornography use, and so I thought it might be helpful to talk to a college community and anybody else who's listening on some of the things that I've been able to figure out about the topic of pornography, and I want to share that. And particularly, after giving you some information, I want to give some thoughts on how this might relate to us as Christians. And at the end, as is done at Fish Talks, we'll have an opportunity to have some question and answer time. This content, eventually, as soon as we can get it down and edited, will be posted on YouTube under the title of Porn Idol, Christians and the Problem of Pornography. So please, when you get a chance, repost this and share it. If you think it's helpful, that is, please share it. This is a frank conversation, but there's nothing graphic that we're going to be covering. I want to say one more thing. In addition to thanking the student government of Palm Beach Atlantic University, I want to thank the Barna organization, www.barna.org. You're going to see a few very interesting slides that some of the more nationally known speakers have been using, thanks to a project between the Josh McDowell Ministry and the Barna Group. And they were nice enough to let me borrow a few of their slides, and I have permission to use them tonight. So I want to thank the Barna Group. All right, the title of this talk is Porn Idol. Why? I think because many of us have made pornography an idol. And the goal of this talk is to give my humble psychological opinion of how we, as Christians in particular, have gotten there. I'm sorry for a few of you that came here that was hoping this would be one of those Christian testimonials of a former porn star. Those are always interesting, and you can find those online as well, but that's not what we're going to have tonight. Here's what I'm going to be talking about. This is my outline. I'm going to talk about the cultural shift, the magnitude of the problem, how it works, as if you didn't know, some consequences, Christians and the problems of pornography, the moral imperatives, and two relationships that solve the problem. All right, for you younger folks, that's a big stack of VHS tapes. Yeah, it's old school. And the thing next to it is a VHS player, and if you wanted to watch a pornographic movie, you would have to go to a video store. Some of you do remember when you were little kids, there were things called Blockbusters. Those are video stores. You could rent VHS tapes, and if you wanted to watch a pornographic movie, you had to have a VHS player, and then you had to go to rent the tape. And of course, what that meant was that pornography use required effort. The VHS tape format actually became popular in the mid-1980s, and you could obtain pornographic movies, but it was a very public process. You had to hope that your pastor wasn't looking through the G-rated section as you made your way to the room in the back where they had the X-rated section. So about 25 years ago, a client came to me seeking some counseling for her marriage, and this is what she presented. This was in the late 1980s. She said, Dr. McCulloch, this is the situation in my home. My husband, out in the garage, we have kind of like a laundry room, and he actually sealed the laundry room off and put a locked door, a door that locked from the inside, and he put his VHS recorder, like the one that I showed you there, and what he would do is he would come home and lock himself in that room and watch pornographic videos for hours on end every day. I had absolutely no category for that behavior, and I just thought she was exasperated with regard to her marriage, and I just thought to myself, how odd. Someone would come home and spend hours looking at porn. But there's been a cultural shift, as you know. The cultural shift is, well, you know what's the game changer? Smartphone. I heard it. Smartphones is the game changer. This is a picture. Well, look at this. Is the happily married couple, first of all. Secondly, the smartphone. That photo, by the way, is from Eric Pickersgill, and you should check out his website. He documents the effect of the smartphone in modern relationships, and he has an essay called "Removed" that you can check out. The smartphone is a game changer because it allows instant access to pornography in a manner that is generally private, so you can access it quickly and privately. And access is a key element pushing the current magnitude of the problem, as well as to playing into the addictive qualities of porn use. Smartphone apps also make the hookup culture possible and provides a platform for sexual addiction. This is a quote from the Barna Group, whose slides you're going to see next. The Barna Group states, "Pornography is not new, but the digital age has made it more ubiquitous and accessible than ever before. The technological realities of smartphones and high-speed internet have fundamentally changed the landscape of pornography and ushered it into the cultural mainstream, where it enjoys increasingly widespread acceptance." Here's what they mean. Here's what they found. This was their study, and it's a very good study of our society, and they found that 54% of porn users say it really doesn't bother them to use porn. If that's true, maybe it's time for Christians to have a conversation on this topic. 1 out of 3 Americans seek out porn at least once a month. 1 in 3, that's 33% of this room, at least once a month. And here, the Barna Group, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to see than I would like, but I'll just tell you what these little numbers mean. Frequency of porn use, and here what they're looking at is people who use porn once or twice a month, or at least that's what they admit to, right? And 72% of males between the age of 13 and 24. That's 72%, 13 to 24. So that's like high school, junior high school age through college. And when you're talking, and this particular survey looked at religion and tied it into the survey and faith. And so for non-practicing Christians, the rate was 72% of males 1 or 2 times a month. All right? It goes down for when you get a little older, so it's 55% of those over the age of 25. And then we look at Christians. These are people who identify themselves as practicing Christians. I'm not sure whether they use church attendance or what the requirement was, but practicing Christians, it goes to 41%. Okay? And not practicing Christians, for females, it was 36%, and then for Christians, it goes down to 17%. the real interesting point here is the other slide here that they have in the bottom, and they have like 4 out of 10. There's 4 yellow out of 10 individuals. And it says here, and I think it's important to read, it's important for Christian leaders, especially youth and young adult pastors, to notice that people who are third most likely to use porn are young teenage adult males, young teen and young adult males in the church, while still below that of their peers who are not practicing Christian in frequency. So essentially what you have, if I can translate this to you, for Christian teenagers, these would be actively Christians, those in youth group, the figure is 4 in 10, and then societally, for those who aren't Christians, it's 7 in 10 of that age group and gender. Does that make sense? Okay. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the magnitude of the problem. And you've probably seen a lot of this stuff before, so I'm just going to hit some of my favorite highlights here. There are 4.2 million porn websites currently in operation. So we're not talking about dead websites, we're talking about 4.2 million in operation. And the next one really kind of gets to me. 100,000 sites that are related to illegal child pornography. How is that even possible? And again, you see the same thing among college and graduate students. So just depending on how you look at it, 69% of all men, if you kind of put it all together, and 10% of women view porn at least once a month. But you have to remember that those figures could go up or down depending on what the frequency question is. Now this is the one that I like to highlight, though, because I interacted with this little figure. The United States, and people don't always know this, the United States has a population of 319 million. I looked that up. The U.S. has a population of 319 million, and it has 245 million porn web pages. So that's almost one porn web page for every individual in the United States. That means that there's a porn web page for your grandmother. Okay? While Germany, look at this, Germany has a population of 80 million, and they have 10 million web pages. So they're really far behind. Or to look at it this way, the United States is really leading the curve here. Hollywood makes about 400 commercial movies a year. The porn industry makes 11,000 porn movies a year. Every second, $3,000 is spent on pornography. Every second, 28,000 people are viewing pornography. And 372 people are typing, or at least trying to type, adult search terms. Every 39 minutes, based on what I told you before, a new pornographic video is created in the United States. What about Christians? One youth pastor said about 90% of what kids come to him for help for are porn addiction, all from Christian families. I want to come back to this because what happens is youth pastors get Christians who come to him and say, they come to the youth pastor and say something along the lines of, I believe I'm addicted to pornography, and I'm going to address that in a little bit. 21% of Christian girls admit to having texted a sexually explicit picture of themselves. Christian mission agencies no longer ask if they watch pornography, but how often. And Christianity Today found that about 40% of pastors are struggling with pornography. That's 40% of pastors. Pornographic and internet use is cited in divorce cases, and I've seen this in my own practice. I work with people who have sexual addictions and pornography addictions, but I also do marriage counseling, and in the marriage counseling, we've done that, and that issue has come up. And 56% of people who get divorced say that one party had an obsessive interest in porn. Okay, I want to tell a story. Again, this goes back to about, 12 25 years ago. A young lady, attractive young lady, probably about 28, 30 years old, comes to see me, and she is a former cocaine user. In her teens and early college years, she was very much addicted to cocaine, and then she struggled to get away from it. But by about the time that she came to see me, she was now sober from cocaine use. And I am not a substance abuse counselor. That's not my specialty. So she didn't come to me for that. She came to me for a marriage issue. And what she said to me, she said, "Dr. McCulloch, I have this problem. My problem is that I have no interest in sex, like none, zero zip. I didn't used to feel that way when I was younger, and now I don't get any pleasure out of having sexuality." And there's an actual regular diagnosis for that. I give this story in my abnormal class. It's called, what is it called here? Post-cocaine addiction, depression, and anhedonia. Anhedonia is when people lose pleasure in things. And it seems one possible explanation is those neurotransmitters that fire, i.e. particularly dopamine and serotonin, those things that fire when people have sex or when she was using cocaine, it's possible, and this is kind of a layman's explanation, that maybe she burnt out her dopamine and serotonin. And so now when she has sex, it's like she used it all up, all the pleasure up, when she was a cocaine addict. Now the other explanation is sex just isn't as exciting when you're not using cocaine. That is a possible explanation. But she had chosen to be sober, but it was alarming that she lost the ability to experience pleasure in sexuality. And I share that with my class, and you know, the students usually feel a lot of empathy for this person. Wow, that would be a horrible thing to engage in sexuality and not feel any pleasure. True? True. I'm going to come back to it because it seems to be that pornography is doing the same thing to young men, and an alarming a number of them, something similar to what I just described to this woman. So that's why I have to explain how it works. And here's how it works. This is a picture of the brain, and what you see there, I don't have a laser, but I would show you that you see some lines pointing to the top of the brain stem, and then where you have that little green spot, the nucleus accumbens, that's where the dopamine is, that's where the dopamine pathway is, and that's where our pleasure center is. So when we do something pleasurable, we receive a certain amount of dopamine release in that area. And just to give you an idea, for a normal individual, if they have a drink of alcohol or they eat some food that they enjoy, they'll get 100% release of dopamine. So whatever the dopamine amount is, and it could be a relative amount, when you have one beer, a glass of wine, or if you have some food that you enjoy, you get that full, in a normal individual, they get that full normal response, which is brought to you via the neurotransmitter dopamine in that particular pleasure area. Okay? Interestingly enough, if you take cocaine, the dopamine level is 3 times that. So you get a 300% experience of pleasure. And if you take methamphetamine, you get an 11 times the amount of pleasure. What's pornography? Well, pornography is somewhere in between the cocaine and meth area. After a while, people lose the ability to experience that normal dopamine sensation. So people who are normal, the red in that, this is the blue PET scan, I believe, or it might be a functional MRI of brains, and the blue area is the cross-section there of the bottom of a brain, and you can see you can see the pleasure center is what's being highlighted there. And when the red lights up, that shows the presence of dopamine. So that's a normal brain eating or having a drink, and then you see a lot of red there because it's pleasurable. You see that? Okay. And then the next person over there is a person who has a problem with eating. In other words, they eat obsessively, and then when they would have the food, so if the comparison is eating food, and then you have someone eating food, you notice there's not much dopamine. In other words, they've kind of burnt out the dopamine. And the same thing with the cocaine user on the bottom, so that would be like the slide. You also see some brain function deterioration, right? You have less, it's not quite as healthy as it should be. But also you see less, the cocaine user is having less, remember the young lady with the cocaine post-addiction anhedonia? Right? And so that's what you see. You don't see any red, you don't see dopamine release for her. And the same thing with an alcoholic. But it's interesting with the alcoholic, you do see a little bit of red. So there's always a little bit of dopamine hit, even for a person whose brain looks like it's not doing too well. It sounds like at least there's something happening there. Okay? So dopamine seems to be the thing that I'm talking about here, and you can imagine how a person could really experience or get a charge out of looking at pornography, but we also have a concern about perhaps burning that out a little bit. The next slide is something that you can get. You can go on YouTube, and I would actually recommend that you watch a YouTube video by Gary Wilson. It's a TED Talk, and the title of the TED Talk is The Great Porn Experiment. And this slide is stolen from that presentation. And Gary Wilson talks about the Coolidge effect. Okay? In the Coolidge effect, what you have is in mating, and here we have pictures of rats mating, and how long it takes for them to be aroused or to get sexually excited. And the arousal rate takes longer when the person starts to become familiar with the person, with the rat that they're mating with. Okay? Did I say person? Persons mating with rats is a whole nother department. Yeah, that's the other talk, right. Okay. In this one, we have rat, please edit that out. There's a novelty effect. If the rat has the same partner, after time, it takes longer for them to be aroused. But if you switch partners, you have a novelty effect, and there's very quick arousal. And as long as you keep switching, you get the arousal factor. Does this sound like clicking on the internet? As soon as you click to something novel, you get a little more of the dopamine hit. After a while, you could see that the search then becomes more about novelty than about what you might be looking for. So what's sexy can quickly get weird. Now, I picked this because I could have picked all kinds of weird things. I thought this would be safe. But things can get weird. And there's more to it. One of the things I'm going to talk about in just a couple of slides is the idea of neuroplasticity. And people in that field like to make this little comment: nerves that fire together bond together. And here's something that was discovered, and this was debated for a long time in neuroscience and in psychology, whether this was really happening or not. And that's whether the brain had kind of what they call plastic, or was adaptable enough that it could actually kind of start to form after a person had reached a developmental age. And in fact, what happens is, as we do certain activities that are pleasurable, the brain kind of adjusts to make that more helpful. It's like, oh, that's good. I'll make a pathway for that, so to speak. So nerves that are firing a lot tend to kind of redevelop themselves, and that's called neuroplasticity. And the development of neuroplasticity is you can have mental repetition, so you could look at something at pornography, but then you could just spend time thinking about it and remembering it, and it's like you're kind of adapting your brain to be prepared for that. Okay? And so this can be a very healthy thing for people. In other words, if you have experience, so it's like riding a bike or learning a real technical skill. You start to actually develop like a part for that in your brain, like the violin. I was actually in this hall last year to listen to a violinist virtuoso right here on this stage. And I am sure that she had parts of her brain that had to do with, these kind of motor movements for years of practice. So years of doing the same thing starts to create kind of a pathway in the brain or an area for that. Now, that idea is a controversial one, but I'm going to show you some things related to that. I also think if you know what we know about memory and what kinds of things would develop, well, the things that might stick in our brain might have to do with things that we could remember better, or things that are more arousing or more shocking to us or have some more impact for us. And so the interesting thing is, do you remember where I showed you where in the kind of the lower part of the brain, if you look at, you see this thing that loops around and it's red, and then there's a color there that would be like kind of a purplish. What is that? What's magenta color? Thank you. So when you see the magenta, if you remember, that's sort of like where that pleasure center was, right? So now when you look at that slide, notice that area right there in the pleasure center is something called the amygdala. And the amygdala is sort of we have the pleasure center, but right next to the pleasure center, you have the anger center, the rage section, the part of the brain that activates rage. There's a fine line between love and hate. Okay? And that fine line is right there. And right next to that, the thing that I was pointing to, the red thing, that's the hippocampus, and that's where memories are formed. So notice you have this part of the brain that talks about rage, you have a part of the brain that talks about memory, and you have the pleasure center all mixed together. So here's my point is, maybe certain things that are more shocking, things that we look at that are a little more extreme, that causes more extreme emotions, that kind of response, maybe those are the things that kind of stand out more, and maybe that's what we can kind of start to train our brain, or the brain can start to train itself to that. And if that's associated with pleasure, you see where I'm going with this? Do you follow where this is going? But I remember I said that was controversial, but here's a study in which some people still have a little bit of, I have seen some negative comments about this study in terms of scientists do debate these things. But this is a study by Valerie Voon at the University of Cambridge. And what she did was she took healthy volunteers who were not addicted to pornography. She had to find them. Right? Just healthy volunteers who had a low use of pornography. And she volunteered, and these are functional MRI views, and they do something to light up the area that they're interested in. And I don't know exactly how they do this because it's pretty amazing stuff. But you see the response pattern, and if you look at the far left side, that's the picture of the brain that I was showing you, but just reverse mirror it. So the pleasure center is now, rather than over to your left, it's over to your right. But that's that same area that I was talking about. And they had these people, while they were on these functional MRIs, they had them view pornography, and you notice how it works. That area lights up. Okay? And then you see that in different in other words, they look at it at different angles. Okay? Then they took people who were compulsive porn users. They showed them the material, and look what has happened with the brain. The brain has developed a reception area, a much larger reception area for porn. In other words, this second group has wired themselves for porn response. Okay, that's from compulsive use. One other little thing. Porn sex is a lower brainstem activity. In other words, what activates the lower brainstem area that I've been showing you, that activates that area, is in fact the lower brainstem. The upper brainstem, for those of you who have taken Gen Psych and things like that, know that the frontal lobe and the rest of our cerebral cortex, the upper things, is where higher level functioning activity takes place. Porn seems to obviously be affecting the lower brainstem. And in some cases, faces are not really even needed. And in fact, facial recognition is in a whole other part of the brain. It's in the opposite area. It's backed by the occipital lobe, but it also uses other parts of the brain that are noted here. None of them are where the primitive, the lower brainstem brain activity is. So here's the conclusion about this. What is needed for a love relationship is not the same as a porn relationship. That's a quote from Helen Fisher, the relationship expert. Porn is about dopamine and serotonin. In other words, it's about firing up the lower, more primitive part of your brain, and long-term loving relationships are about the release of a completely other neurotransmitter called oxytocin, which is the bonding neurotransmitter. So here's how this works. In the digital world, you get a dopamine hit on your lower brainstem in the pleasure center for clicking and searching, constant novelty, shock and surprise, and voyeurism, and this seems to happen when a person is alone, typically. Right? Remember the smartphone. Whereas in the real world, where people have pleasure and oxytocin is released in bonding real relationships, you have things like courtship, touching, smells, pheromones, emotional connection, and interaction with the real person. Some of the consequences. The impact of pornography on its user has been hotly debated for decades. In the 1970s, most psychologists, and I am a psychologist, felt, when porn was first introduced in the 1970s, at least the version they had then, is that maybe this could be used, at least in secular settings, maybe this can be used to educate people about sexuality, and it might even improve open-minded couples' sex lives. But lately, there's been some research that pornography can have harmful consequences, and we're not talking about people who are Christians, but we're talking about people who work in the field of research. However, it should be noted that the research is not definitive. I would say, and now the next slide you're going to see is a slide that I created, is a key factor in the difference between traditional pornography and what has been called contemporary pornography. Traditional pornography, which is what I grew up with, were static images of nudity. Movies with sexually implicit content, but often in a relational or consensual context. Often it was hard, or would be hard now, to look at those static images of nudity, for instance, and separate them from art images or depictions or performances. Would say, if you think of things that include nudity, that would be more like traditional pornography. But contemporary pornography is a little different, and it's tailored more to what you see on your smartphone. Video images or clips that are not part of a larger movie with a relational narrative. And this information I derived from other sources. 94% of contemporary pornography is misogynistic in content. In other words, it's anti-women. 88% show physical aggression to women, and 41% involve sexual acts that are extremely degrading to the sexual performers, usually women. Notice the difference between traditional and contemporary pornography. So what are the consequences of all this? If that's how it works, what are some general consequences? Well, some general consequences for people is that the people who view pornography of an unrealistic portrayal of they see an unrealistic portrayal of sexuality. They develop an increasing sexual preoccupation. People who view porn tend to think about porn. Remember what I was saying about neuroplasticity and the hippocampus and things like that. It's like, you know, you've all watched a movie, like maybe you watched a horror film and it stuck with you the next day and you thought about it and you were like jumpy the next day. Well, people who, it's the same, and there's no reason why it would be any different. When people view pornography, they think about sex like the next day. They become preoccupied with it. They become distracted by thoughts of sex, and there's evidence that there is lessening of progressive attitudes towards women, and an increasing belief that women are to be used as sex objects. I already mentioned Gary Wilson, and if you look at his video, which I recommend, The Great Porn Experiment, he talks about arousal addictions, i.e. sexual type addictions, as producing symptoms that are very similar to these diagnoses. ADHD, hyperactivity, right? Social anxiety, depression, performance anxiety, and OCD. By the way, do we see a lot of that on college campuses and among young people? Remember, 72% of young people look at porn, and here's one of the consequences. And by the way, Gary Wilson is clear to make it clear that he is not speaking as a Christian in any way when he says this. He's saying, this is what we see. This was really this idea that there's a connection between social anxiety and an increase in social anxiety and a decrease in social skills was first kind of came to the forefront in popular culture by people viewing Philip Zimbardo's TED Talk about the demise of guys, where he talks about the same thing. Gary Wilson calls this the brain fog. You get a brain fog from overuse of pornography, and it produces some of these symptoms. Ironically, overuse of pornography also rewires the brain so that many men suffer from the inability to perform sexually. There's an actual condition called pornography-induced erectile dysfunction, and that was reported not too long this year in Time magazine. This condition may also result in a detachment by males from their real-life partners and bonding with their porn star idols. In other words, real sex has lost its zip for young men, and they are not able to perform sexually. Remember the woman who was the ex-cocaine addict and her sad story? The other possibility here is marital dissatisfaction. Many of my married clients, male and female, know that they cannot measure up to the unrealistic sex portrayed in pornography, so their own sense of sexual satisfaction is decreased. Some females, on the other hand, usually in secular settings, will try to compete with pornography. Some females compete with the pornography in some sort of nuclear arms race of sexuality. But as in life, that just leaves everyone burned. Marriages filled with pornography are joyless marriages. Again, that is from anecdotal evidence that I've seen in my own practice and what other people who practice in this field have told me. You remember this guy, those of you who took Gen Psych? This is Conrad Lorenz, and he has these geese think he's his mother. He was around at the time they were born, and they imprinted to him, and he was the guy who figured that out. Conrad Lorenz, by the way, is not the source of this lower quote because he died in 1989. But he noted that our brains are remarkable at adapting cognitively to what they see, their world. So the geese would think that he was their dad, and that allowed for them to survive. A geese could imprint itself in absence of a mother to another being, and that worked for them. And you might ask yourself then, since that's how our brains work, you might ask yourself, are we imprinting or adapting our brains to porn sex? This becomes a particular issue when we think about the number of children. There's 6 million children between the ages of 7 and 12 are exposed to pornography. You know that there are plenty of homes and there are plenty of kids who are about 10 years old who have access to pornography on their home computers or on somebody's smartphone, right? Patrick Carnes is the kind of the founder of the sexual addiction movement and the treatment of sexual addiction. And this is a quote from him: "The meaning of sexuality is being shanghaied for a whole new generation." I think this is a particularly important issue for Christians, and I'm going to talk about why, and that's where this background information is going. But a study was done by some guys by the name of Regernus and Euchre. Regernus is at the University of Texas, and he looked at premarital sex in America, and he looked at the amount of premarital sex in America. That was his interest. And here's what he found. It's rather interesting. You might be surprised by this slide. He found that people who were not in college, that were like in their 20s, college age, but they were not going to college and reported being modestly religious, but were not college students, he found that of that age group, only 14% of males and 16% of those reported being virgins. Now, many of these people could actually be married because these people are not in college, okay? However, he also used a category. In his study, he deliberately looked at Christian colleges, which would be similar to PBA or places like PBA or Liberty University. He looked at places like that, 4 years religious colleges, and not generally religious, but 4-year Christian colleges, and he found in the population that 52% of males were virgins and 63% of females were virgins. So if you're in this lecture here tonight and you're a virgin, you actually are not in a minority, even though in our present culture you might think you were before you walked in here. But if you are a virgin, the issue is going to be, how do I deal with the topic of pornography? What can I do about it? And it's a concern. Christians used to worry about things like Smurfs. What am I talking about? Well, I have a daughter who's 29 years old, and I distinctly remember in my little conservative Christian world, my wife and I were over at someone's house one day, and some of the housewives, Christian housewives, were there, and we had kids that were anywhere from about 6 to 10 years old, 5 to 10 years old, and in that age range, little kids. I don't remember the ages actually, but I do remember the conversation. Should we let these 10-year-olds watch the Smurfs? I wish that was the thing that we had to worry about for 10-year-olds watching anymore. I would tell a 10-year-old, watch as much of the Smurfs as you can. All right, let me address, and I'll try to be quick, Christians and the problems of pornography. One of the things about Christians is that we tend to be good at being two-faced. That, in other words, hi, how are you? I'm fine. Praise the Lord. Right? So that means we also get good at hiding things. And let me give you another gen psych term, cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a good term for college students to know. Cognitive dissonance is when people do things that they do not personally hold as acceptable, and it creates cognitive dissonance. It creates this kind of mental weird feeling when I do things that are not acceptable. And we tend to respond to this uncomfortable feeling of dissonance in one of two ways. We either stop the behavior, or we end up minimizing or justifying the behavior. I can either just downplay it, or I can stop it, or I've got a third option for Christians. Another response is to compartmentalize the behavior and essentially suppress any conscious analysis of that behavior, which in turn makes people less fully aware of what they're doing. Pornography viewing becomes an alien behavior practiced by human Christians. That's cognitive dissonance. And we start to lose touch with ourselves. Here's a quote from Thoreau. The man who goes to the post office a lot has not heard from himself in a while. Many Christians and religious people are what people in the field of sex addiction research call sex negative. Being black and white about sex usually makes religious individuals more susceptible to pornography addiction or to report pornography addiction, according to a study by Grubbs et al. 2015. Entitled Religiosity and Moral Disapproval. This is something that's been noted in the field for a while. People that are raised in homes that have a real negative attitude towards sexuality and make sexuality itself as a category more taboo tend to get very black and white attitudes towards sexuality, which for some reason makes those people more apt to report that they're addicted to pornography. It's like they've gotten out of balance. Remember this guy? That's Carl Jung. And he believed that our personalities were all formed by opposites, things like introversion, extroversion. He believed that the male had an opposite, the opposite of a male was the anima, the female side, and that females have a male side to them. So there's all these sets of opposites. It's interesting, he proposed that the opposite of religion was, so you have male, female, introvert, extrovert, conscious, unconscious, religion, sex. He put sex on the opposite continuum of religion because so many times in history you have people that are highly religious are also apparently anti-sex. So you have this kind of imbalance there, right? So there's a lack of balance. And it creates a false dichotomy between sex and religion. And that opens up a possibility of a false choice. It's either sex or religion. An increasingly important issue in today's culture, this issue of balance is an increasingly important issue in today's culture where young people attain sexual maturity late in middle school but do not marry until after college. Okay, there is, a couple of a decade and a half, a couple of decades between when a person becomes able to be sexually active and when they tend to get married. So you've got 2 decades of people having to be single and deal with the issue of sexuality. For secularists, it's the hookup culture and its resultant poor future relationships. For Christians, it is often, but not always, pornography and a lot of cognitive dissonance, guilt, shame, and this needs to be discussed and addressed. Churches have to begin to address the needs that singles face in the U.S. Did you know that this is the first time in the history that there are more people in the United States that are single than married? The last census found more single people than married individuals. So perhaps we need greater discussion or a more nuanced but biblical view of sexuality needs to be discussed. Just some comments, and I'll go through these really fast. The moral imperatives. You get it. Porn is anti-women. We've already discussed how contemporary porn is highly degrading and objectifying of women. There was a study that was done that found having college male just view 4 hours of pornography would alter their views of rape against women, seeing it as increasingly acceptable the more porn they watched. This is a quote from Rob Weiss, who is a sexual addiction expert. The internet is a culture, and attachments are not forming at home. It's changing our view of monogamy. And I could say more about that, but we're running out of time. The other thing that happens is that I believe, this is my own slide here, at least I put this slide in to demonstrate that it widens the gap between what men and women find as desirable. Think about it. You spend hours training your brain, particularly if you're not engaging in sexuality, if you're a virgin, you spend hours looking on the internet and looking at what's pleasurable for you, and sometimes that's sexually explicit material, or sometimes, in the case of women, it may be fantasy material, and you're looking at that, and women are looking at this, and men are looking at that, and they spend hours doing that, and then it's time to get married and come together, and what's desirable for them is not the same. pretty much when I married my wife, we had kind of like a shared sense about what sexuality was. It was a more limited understanding of sexuality than you guys have. All right? But it was a similar worldview with regard to sexuality. I think males and females are creating separate worlds, and I think that's going to be a problem. Pornography is love's executioner. It's an enslavement, not a freedom, and I just think it's generally kind of soul deadening. I'm pointing out moral issues. It's anti-women, it's widening the gap, it's love's executioner, and most importantly for Christians, porn makes sex slavery possible. Here's how the internet works. Okay? You watch something, and you come back to the computer, and you get more of that. Right? You shop for something online, or if, like the other day, I was looking at a particular model. One of my cars isn't running well, so I thought, oh, I wonder how much this particular car costs. What was all over my internet when I pulled it up? Cars, all kinds of cars that might be similar to that. You know, when you look at movies, even on Amazon or Netflix, it provides an algorithm. You might be interested in this. Do you think it's not true with pornography? You watch pornography, the pornographer rubric says, oh, we need to make this available. And if that isn't available, they have to go manufacture it. And how do they manufacture it? They have to go find sex slaves to be the performers. It's the internet that makes sex slavery possible, and porn use particularly. That's how it works. What you watch will be available for you next time. This guy's name is Ran Garelli, and Ran Garelli has a YouTube video that you must watch. It is called Why I Stopped Watching Porn. It's got at least 13 million views, just in the one I clicked on. I think there's multiple versions of this with many millions of views for each one. But he said he is not a religious person at all, and he makes that clear, but he said, and he's in a relationship with his girlfriend, and he said, I stopped watching porn because, number one, it brought anger and violence into my fantasy life, which I never had before. He said, I'm basically not that kind of person. But all of a sudden, I was starting to have anger and violent images and feelings in my fantasy life. And it occurred to him, by taking a step back, that pornography, in case you didn't realize this, is filmed prostitution. Pornography, this is the moral issue again, is not civil. And nobody is really having fun. I have a quote here that I won't read by C.S. Lewis, but it's about happiness, and it's about laughter. And if you think about what people watch in pornography, it isn't really a lot of people truly having fun and laughing. Next, winning the lottery is not a good thing. Do you believe me? Well, there was a reality show about that. But most people, when they win the lottery, you know, when people get all kinds of like billions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars for work they never did, it usually doesn't go well, right? Winning the lottery is not always the best thing. And having availability of thousands of sexual partners in all different ways that I might imagine of them is not really a good thing either. It doesn't come to a good end. It's kind of like, you know, when Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, if this audience understands what I'm saying, it seemed like when Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, he had 1,000 wives, and he had won the lottery, so to speak. But when he wrote Ecclesiastes, he struck me as kind of being depressed. There isn't a lot of laughter there. And there's not going to be a lot of laughter if this is your sexual lottery. Porn is basically a passive sin, but it's not an active one. It's a passive thing. It's something you can do very passively, but it often leads to active sin. And so it becomes an issue of wisdom. Is this something that I really want to do? Would it be wise for me to look at this? Is this something that I want to make a choice of morally? And then there are times, and I don't have the time to read this quote by Charles Spurgeon, but there are times when we just need to run from sexual sin. It's better just to flee. Sometimes there's no other option. The quote, "Some things are just plain wrong," is from my secular friend, Rob Weiss, and that was a quote from him. Some things are just plain wrong. And I have clients who come and tell me, and this is a field I work in, I have clients that tell me, guys that tell me honestly, when they look at porn, they kind of look at it like this. It's like, I'm interested, literally, because it's like, I'm interested in pornography, I find it arousing, but I also know what's going on there is morally wrong, so I kind of look at it like that. If you've ever had that experience, it's time to just flee. Okay, this is an important slide, and I appreciate you coming here and letting me run over just a little bit, but this is an important slide. I'm going to talk about this and two relationships. Number one, you really need to educate yourself. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but when college student guys come to me and they say they've had a problem with porn use, I say to them, you need to go on the internet and you need to educate yourself about pornography. That's what I did. This was just stuff I put together. Most of this material belongs to other people, and I have a citation page at the end. But you need to do the same thing. You need to educate yourself and start making your own choices about pornography. All right? And you'll find that it's a moral issue for all those reasons that I gave you. The other thing is, it is an addictive process. A question somebody's going to ask, is pornography an addiction? And the answer is, it is similar. It is an addictive process, and we can debate that, but it really doesn't matter. Educate yourself about that. Come to your own conclusion. The next thing you ought to do is detox yourself. Just stop using porn until the brain fog clears, and it will clear. It's interesting, in the studies, in the Time magazine article, and the studies that Gary Wilson talks about, when people detox themselves from porn to get out of the brain fog, they found that it took older guys that were like my age that were using porn compulsively, it took about 6 months for me to be able to, somebody my age, to be able to get clean and sober and get out of the fog. But for younger guys, it only took about 3 months. So, it's not too long a time period. You should limit access, you should stop it, detoxify yourself, limit future access, consider programs that limit it like Covenant Eyes, and get into some kind of accountability. Next, you ought to know yourself. Know your triggers. What are the things that makes you more likely to use pornography? You should be in touch with your own body in the sense of, how are you feeling? Are you angry? Are you depressed? Are you lonely? What does it feel like? And what do you do when you have those sensations in your body? Sometimes Christians are just completely cut off sometimes from their bodies, and we have to also be wise. And then we can go back and deal with the depression, anger, and loneliness directly. Do you have a plan? If you felt depressed on Friday night, tomorrow night, if you're depressed on a Friday night, do you have a plan of what you would do for that? Or are you just going to use your smartphone? There are two relationships that do help solve this problem. And I just love this quote. Sometimes it's hard to find an enemy who has outposts in your head. And sometimes we can't do this alone. And the first relationships that I'm going to tell you is community. I don't know if you're familiar. I know there's a couple psychologists in the audience, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Rat Park study. Dr. Wolin O'Connor? Dr. Maslow? Are you familiar with the Rat Park study? Okay, so here's the summary very quickly. As you know, that psychologists will sometimes study addictions in the laboratory, and they'll take rats and they'll addict them to ecstasy or heroin or morphine or whatever it is that they're studying, and typically those rats live in cages, right? Well, back in the 70s, I believe it was, a group, 1977, out in Western Canada, some researchers decided, I wonder what would happen if we did the same kinds of addiction studies with the rats, but we let them live in their own lovely little community, like a rat park. And instead of living in a cage, they got to run around in a place that looked really like a great place for rats. And here's what they found. They found that those rats, when we're given the option of drinking morphine solutions that would addict them versus the ones in the cage, the rats resisted drinking the morphine. And they only drank it when they were forced to, because they would rather play in the rat park and be in community than get addicted to the morphine. But the ones in the cages got addicted like they did in all the studies. So it changed sort of the outcomes of the study. And the real interesting thing is, when you're addicted to morphine or heroin, the withdrawal symptoms are horrible. And people sometimes just can't take it almost. And in the rat part study, the rats who wanted to get back into community were willing to undergo withdrawal symptoms just to be able to get back to the rat park. Community was more powerful than the drug. But the ones that were in the cages, they succumbed to getting addicted, and they couldn't kick their habit. That set of slides is from Stuart McMillan, and I think you should go look at his comics on slide. He does psych research comics. There's an exciting comic field. Okay. All right, so the upshot is relationship with community. Pornography use is often triggered by loneliness, boredom, and only community and real relationships offer a satisfying alternative to pornography. If you go back to that TED Talk by Philip Zimbardo, he points out that many guys in particular need to learn how to be in relationships. A burden is lighter when it's shared. Transparency and truthfulness are freeing. And Christians sometimes have trouble sharing. They're not supposed to have this problem, so they don't share it in community. They are suspicious also of non-Christian groups that are struggling in making progress with this area, so there is a lot of learning and experience that could help them that gets rejected. So we need a relationship with community. There's a quote in here for SA. All I'm going to say on this slide is there is something called Sexaholics Anonymous, SA groups. And for people who have acting out problems, people who are no longer watching porn, but are actually acting out in ways that are harmful, SA is a very helpful place to go to. It's a community. The other relationship that's important that we know as Christians is a transformative relationship with Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us that if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creature, and the new creature has come, and the old is gone, and the new is here. And Ephesians talks about putting off the old self and the new self. And what we need is a transformative relationship, something that is actually an alternative to what we're doing with pornography. David Foster Wallace is a secular, he committed suicide unfortunately, but was a very well-known kind of a bad boy fiction writer. And he gave it a commencement address at Kenyon University in 2005, known kind of famously in English circles as the "This is Water" speech. You can see it online. Go read it. That's the Kenyon commencement speech. And he said in there, it's interesting coming from a secular fiction writer, that everyone worships something. And I don't think as Christians we should be surprised that porn has become an idol for many of us, because porn and sexuality as idolatry has a long history dating back to the Old Testament. Here's the god Dagon, a fertility god, by the way, falling before the Ark of the Covenant. A transformational relationship with Jesus Christ can break down our idols. I'm going to tell you one more study, and this is the sum of it. There was a study done, and in that study with college-age students like yourself, they found that 64% of men and 25% of women would rather shock themselves than sit alone quietly with their thoughts for 15 minutes. Yeah, I'll repeat that. 64% of men and 25% of women were given an option. You can shock yourself, or you can sit alone with your thoughts for 15 minutes. The majority of guys went for the shocks. What does this tell us? It tells us that maybe people out there, because this is just a general study, maybe it's a spiritual issue. 12-step programs talk about spirituality, But really, this maybe Christian spiritual formation is something that we need to look at. If you look at the classic work by Richard Foster, he had these topics for spiritual life: prayer, fasting, meditation, study, simplicity, solitude, submission, confession, worship, and celebration. Maybe if we were a little bit better at meditating, prayer life, or just sitting in solitude, we would begin to see that as an alternative to porn use. And that's all I've got to say. The next slide are my references. And finally, I'd like to remind you that I'm Don McCulloch, and you can contact me at don_McCulloch@pba.edu. That's Don McCulloch at pba.edu. Thanks a lot for listening to me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you. You guys don't mind staying up late, do you? You're college students. The format of the Fishtalk, which is brought to you by student government, is to allow for some questions and interaction. And so I'm going to spend maybe 10 minutes taking some questions and trying to answer anything that came to mind while you were watching those slides in this presentation. Are there any questions? Please jump in there. Yes?
Why is a porn problem so much more common with men than
Yeah,
women?
I think men and women are fundamentally wired a little differently. And actually, the content of porn, that when women get addicted to porn, the content of porn is often very much narrative-based, and it isn't so much contemporary porn-based, which are these very short clips, and actually they're very graphic short clips of people involved in sexual acts, whereas women tend to be more interested in a larger context, a relational context, and I think men and women are differently. And so when women get addicted to pornography, they're often addicted to things like fantasy porn and pornography that has a narrative, whereas even if it's a very unrealistic narrative, but it is different. And so clearly the other type of porn just is the way men are wired, and we could answer that there. But I think there's a physiological basis for that. I'm not sure existentially why, but physiologically why. That seems to be what happens there. Yes?
Are there many statistics for pornographic literature for women? Because, like, I'm wondering is if the majority of women who are viewing that stuff on the internet
Yeah.
are viewing fantasy fiction, and that's where the majority of the statistics for women are.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't explore content issues. But that's really a legitimate question, and I don't know for sure, honestly, so I don't want to answer that. My sense is that it is more what I just said. It's more a contextual relation, fantasy, not necessarily fantasy stuff. It can be sexual, but it is more in a relational context. Remember, the material, the contemporary porn that a lot of guys get addicted to is very anti-women. I mean, it's very misogynistic. Over 90%, 88% is just basically straight out abusive. So it would be hard to see that that would be something that the majority of women would get addicted to. There might be a small percentage of people that are aroused by that kind of stuff, but for the most part, that wouldn't follow naturally, which is kind of what we think is happening with pornography. Couple more questions. Yeah?
Do you have a relative statistic of what percentage is child pornography that people are watching?
I don't know. I am troubled by that, but remember, the issue here is you get what you look for, and it is a trend on, I'll just state this as a guy, that pornography themes seem to be about younger and younger women, like young women, and that seems to be a whole genre of pornography, and I would imagine if you're looking for shock and awe, that you would see that there would be a natural downward progression in the age of the performers or the people that they want to see. So it seems like one of the problems with pornography is by nature, some people are naturally going to go in that direction. So the existence of graphic, easily accessible pornography, the fact that that exists means that there's always going to be a problem in that area. And also, the age at which people view pornography would be very important. You're asking about child pornography, which is a very important question. But I also am concerned about the age at which people begin viewing pornography and what that does to their sense of development in their brains. And it's interesting in England, where they're able to have much more civil conversations about these things and people not getting all excited. There has been quite a bit of discussion at the government levels of just across the board limiting pornography access for minors or certain younger ages. And people in England are actually trying to address that issue directly with a conversation that, as far as I know, we're not having. Child pornography is illegal, but we're not necessarily working on the other side, the preventative side. Couple more. Yes, sir.
So you said that we can end pornographic addiction between 3 to 6 months, depending on age, and roughly around that timeline. But how long does it take for the brain to rewire?
Right. So you come out of the fog in 3 to 6 months. Great question. But how long it takes to rewire, I don't know. And we know that nerves form slowly. I would recommend getting involved in real relationships and real community, in a real way. And here's what I mean by that. I'm not saying that even half facetiously. People need to not only detoxify themselves, but they have to learn. That was what Philip Zimbardo said. They have to learn relationships. In other words, it wouldn't be, in my mind, it wouldn't be like completely successful if a person just completely got off of porn and then still spent all their time, on the internet and weren't getting involved in real relationships. I think that would be the real antidote. Okay? You're standing, so that means I can take one more question. Yeah?
Did you find a statistic that showed how many people were sexually abused that were addicted to porn?
I have not seen that statistic. You can go to the Barna slides, and they have a lot of slides, and I wouldn't be surprised if that research is out there. It's interesting. The only time that's been studied is in porn sex performers. And there was a study that I read in preparing this material that said that it's sort of iffy. The assumption is that porn performers are from these sexually abused background, and certainly a large percentage of them are, but it may be nowadays with the cultural acceptance that you have a lot of people who are involved in the sex industry that are not from that background. So the idea that everybody, they're doing that, and I think that's important because it's like, they're just doing that because they were sexually abused as, themselves, right? And that may be too broad a sweep, but it would be good to have those figures, particularly in terms of people's addiction to it. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for coming out. Do you want to say anything? Cassie Stanton, Student Government.